Most men don't realize the moment a woman begins to miss them is the moment they finally stop chasing her. And the cruel irony of female psychology is this: the man she once treated like he was replaceable often becomes unforgettable only after he walks away. I'm going to tell you something most men are never taught. Not by their fathers, not by their friends, and definitely not by the women they date. A woman rarely recognizes a man's full value while he is constantly available. That doesn't mean she is evil. It means her mind works through emotional contrast. Human psychology values what feels scarce, meaningful, and slightly out of reach. When something is always there, always forgiving, always waiting, the mind slowly stops registering its importance. Think about the man who always replies instantly, always apologizes first, always adjusts his plans, always makes sure she's comfortable, secure, and happy. On paper, he looks like the perfect partner. But inside her emotional perception, something strange begins to happen. The mystery fades. The tension disappears. The quiet question of, what if I lose him, never appears in her mind. And without that question, appreciation struggles to grow. You see, women often don't measure a man's value by what he gives. They measure it by what it costs them emotionally to lose him. When a man overextends himself trying to prove his worth, he unknowingly removes the very tension that makes people recognize value. And this is where many men unknowingly trap themselves. They believe love means constant reassurance, constant availability, constant effort. But psychological attraction is not built on constant certainty. It grows in the space where respect, curiosity, and emotional independence live together. When a woman senses that a man's world revolves completely around her, a subtle shift happens in her perception. He stops feeling like a prize and starts feeling like a guarantee. And guarantees rarely trigger emotional urgency, but the moment that man begins focusing on his purpose, his growth, his life, the emotional equation changes. Suddenly she notices the silence where his constant attention used to be. She notices the independence she once overlooked. She begins remembering the small things he did that once felt ordinary. And the strange part is, nothing about him actually changed. The only thing that changed was her ability to feel the possibility of losing him. Loss is one of the strongest emotional amplifiers in human psychology. People rarely mourn what they never valued, but they deeply feel the absence of something they quietly depended on. That is why many women only fully process a man's value when the comfort of his presence is gone. Not because they planned it, but because emotional clarity often arrives through distance. And that distance forces the mind to revisit memories with a new lens, the late-night conversations, the patience, the loyalty, the quiet stability he brought into her life. All the things that felt normal suddenly begin to feel rare, and rare things become powerful in memory. This is the moment many men misunderstand. They think walking away means losing. But sometimes walking away is the first moment someone finally sees you clearly, because presence can be invisible, but absence has a voice that echoes loudly in the mind. And once that echo starts, something begins to shift inside her awareness. Not regret yet, not longing yet, but the first quiet realization that the man she thought was ordinary might have been extraordinary all along. And the mind rarely ignores that kind of realization for long. At first, she doesn't call it regret. Her mind gives it softer names: curiosity, nostalgia, a random memory that appears late at night when the room is quiet and the distractions fade. But the truth is more complicated than that. When a woman loses consistent access to a man who once gave her attention, stability, and emotional safety, the brain begins doing something fascinating. It starts reconstructing the past. Human memory is not a perfect recording device. It edits, it rearranges, it highlights details that once seemed insignificant. And this is where the real psychological shift begins. She remembers how calm he was when things got stressful, how he didn't panic during arguments, how he listened more than most people she had met. At the time, those traits felt ordinary, almost invisible. But when she encounters new people, new personalities, new dating experiences, the contrast begins to appear. Maybe the new guy is exciting, but unreliable. Maybe another man is confident, but emotionally distant. Maybe someone else is charming, but selfish. And suddenly, without warning, a quiet thought crosses her mind. He wasn't like this. That thought is powerful because it forces her to compare the present with the past. And comparison is where appreciation is often born. Many men assume women instantly move on emotionally, but psychology rarely works that cleanly. Emotional connections don't disappear the moment a relationship ends. They linger in subtle ways. Certain songs remind her of him. Certain places bring back conversations. Even small habits, phrases he used, the way he reacted to situations, start appearing in her mind again. And here is the twist many men never see coming. The man who once felt predictable begins to feel rare, not because he changed, but because she finally experienced the alternative. Scarcity creates perspective. The more distance there is between her and the stability he once provided, the clearer his value begins to look. But pride often keeps this realization quiet. Most people struggle to admit they overlooked something meaningful. So instead of reaching out immediately, her mind does something else. It observes. Maybe she checks his social media. Maybe she wonders if he's happier now. Maybe she notices that his life didn't collapse without her the way she expected. That realization can be surprisingly powerful. Because many people subconsciously assume that someone who cared deeply for them will always remain emotionally available. When they discover that person is moving forward, growing, building a life without them, it disrupts that assumption, and disruption creates emotional tension. Now the story inside her mind changes. He is no longer the man who was always there. He becomes the man who chose to step away. And the human mind is deeply intrigued by people who choose themselves. Independence signals strength. Strength signals value, and value is what the brain naturally gravitates toward. This is why many women begin reassessing a man only after he stops trying to convince them of his worth. Effort is admirable, but self-respect is magnetic. When a man quietly focuses on his life, his goals, his peace, something subtle happens in the emotional landscape between them. He stops appearing like someone asking to be chosen, and starts appearing like someone who could have chosen many paths, but walked his own. That shift may seem small from the outside, but psychologically, it transforms perception. The man she once took for granted becomes harder to categorize, harder to replace, harder to forget. And once that transformation happens inside her mind, the question that begins forming is no longer about why he cared so much. The question slowly becomes something else. What if she misunderstood his value while she had the chance to experience it every day? And once that question enters her thoughts, it rarely leaves quietly. That question doesn't disappear the next morning. In fact, it usually grows stronger. Because once the mind starts reconsidering the past, it begins looking for proof. Proof that maybe, just maybe, she misunderstood the value of the man she once had. This is where something deeply human begins to happen. Regret doesn't usually arrive as a dramatic emotional explosion. It enters slowly, like a quiet realization that keeps repeating itself in different situations. Maybe she sees a couple laughing together in a cafe. Maybe she hears a story about loyalty or commitment. Maybe she goes through a difficult moment and realizes the person who once helped her stay calm isn't there anymore. And suddenly, she remembers how he used to respond in those moments. How he didn't escalate arguments, how he didn't disappear during hard conversations, how he didn't treat connection like a temporary game. Those memories start rearranging her understanding of him. At the time, she may have believed she could easily find someone with the same qualities. After all, the modern world constantly tells people that better options are always one swipe away. But experience slowly challenges that belief. Because emotional stability is rare. Consistency is rare. A man who genuinely invests in a relationship without manipulation, drama, or ego battles is rarer than many people realize. And when she encounters people who lack those qualities, comparison quietly intensifies. The excitement she once chased begins to feel exhausting. The unpredictability that once seemed thrilling begins to feel unstable. And the man she once viewed as too predictable starts to look different through the lens of maturity. Predictable suddenly means safe. Reliable suddenly means strong. Loyal suddenly means valuable. But here is the uncomfortable truth about human psychology. Timing often decides whether appreciation becomes gratitude or regret. If realization arrives while the connection still exists, people can rebuild. But if realization arrives after distance has already grown too large, the mind is left with something heavier. The awareness that something meaningful was lost because it was not recognized when it mattered. This is why many women go through a phase of quiet reflection after a relationship ends with a man who genuinely cared. They revisit conversations. They rethink arguments. They wonder whether their expectations were influenced by outside voices, social pressure, or temporary temporary emotions. And sometimes the conclusion is painful, not because the relationship was perfect, but because the man she had may have been far more valuable than she understood at the time. Now, here's something many men misunderstand. This realization doesn't always lead to a message, a phone call, or a dramatic return. Sometimes pride, circumstances, or life changes keep people from acting on their feelings. But internally, the recognition still exists. The brain records patterns. And when someone breaks the pattern of being endlessly available, their absence becomes more noticeable than their presence ever was. The man who quietly stepped away without bitterness or chaos often leaves the strongest psychological imprint. Because calm exits create unanswered questions, and unanswered questions have a strange power over the human mind. She might wonder where he is now, who he is becoming, whether someone else now appreciates the things she once overlooked. And that thought can be surprisingly heavy, because appreciation delayed is often appreciation intensified. But by the time the mind reaches that clarity, the man who once stood there offering patience, loyalty, and presence may have already moved forward into a life where he no longer needs validation from the person who once doubted him. And that is the moment when the full weight of realization finally lands. Not when he left, but when she understands what exactly left with him. And some lessons in psychology only reveal themselves after the opportunity to act has already passed. There is something many men misunderstand about value. Value is not created by convincing someone to appreciate you. Real value appears when a person's absence reveals how much stability, care, and strength they quietly brought into someone's life. And this is why the man who grows after a relationship often becomes the man people remember the longest. Not because he tried to prove anything, but because he chose to continue building his life instead of staying stuck in resentment. When a woman eventually realizes the weight of what she lost, she is not just remembering a person. She is remembering a version of her life that felt different. A life where someone showed up consistently. A life where emotional support was present even when things were difficult. A life where she did not have to question loyalty every week. And the more she experiences the world without that stability, the clearer the contrast becomes. Psychology teaches us something important about human nature. People rarely notice the emotional infrastructure that holds their lives together until it disappears. The man who listened patiently. The man who didn't create chaos. The man who offered quiet strength instead of constant drama. Those qualities often feel simple in the moment, but simplicity is deceptive, because peace is one of the rarest experiences in modern relationships. And when someone finally understands the value of peace, they often look back at the person who once offered it. But here is the truth every man needs to understand. Your worth was never defined by whether someone recognized it immediately. Some people only develop the emotional maturity to appreciate certain qualities after they experience the absence of those qualities. That doesn't mean you are not valuable. It simply means their awareness arrived later than your effort. The healthiest thing a man can do in that situation is not chase validation from the past. It is to continue evolving, because growth creates something powerful. It transforms the story. Instead of being remembered as the man who begged to stay, you become the man who respected himself enough to walk forward. And self-respect changes how people remember you. It turns pain into quiet strength. It turns heartbreak into wisdom. It turns rejection into clarity. Over time, people begin to recognize that the man they once underestimated carried something rare: emotional steadiness. And emotional steadiness is a foundation many relationships quietly depend on. But by the time that realization becomes fully clear, life may have already moved both people into different directions. That is not a tragedy. It is simply how human growth sometimes unfolds. Not every lesson is meant to rebuild the past. Some lessons exist so the future can be stronger. So if you are a man who once gave genuine effort, loyalty, and care, understand something important. The right people eventually recognize those qualities, sometimes quickly, sometimes much later. But recognition always arrives for what is real. Now I want to ask you something personal. Think about your last relationship. Did you ever feel like your effort and loyalty were only recognized after you stopped giving them? Be honest. Type yes or no in the comments and tell me what happened. And if this message helped you understand something about relationships and female psychology, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with a friend who might need to hear this truth today.